The fever started 3 days after we cleared the plague hulk, a drifting monstrosity that had materialized in the system's outer reaches, trailing clouds of corruption like diseased afterbirth, and command had dispatched our regiment, the Valdane 33rd Infantry, fresh from garrison duty and utterly unprepared for what awaited us in those festering corridors, to board and purge whatever Xenos or heretic filth had manifested aboard. I remember the smell hitting us first when we breached the outer hull, even through our rebreather units. A stench of rot so profound it seemed to bypass our equipment entirely and lodge directly in our sinuses, sweet and cloying and wrong in ways that made my eyes water and my stomach clench. Sergeant Hollis had laughed at our reactions, his scarred face creasing with what might have been amusement, or might have been the early stages of the corruption that would claim him within hours, telling us that we'd smell worse things before our tour ended if we lived that long, and he was right, though not in the way any of us expected. We found the source in what the tech priests identified as the Hulk's former Medicae Bay, a cavernous chamber whose walls wept fluids that our Auspex readings couldn't classify, where surgical equipment had fused with organic matter into configurations that suggested purpose without revealing function, where something had been conducting experiments or rituals, or simply existing in ways that violated every principle of imperial medicine and Mechanicus doctrine. The entity itself, I hesitate to call it a daemon though, that's clearly what it was, resembled a massive slug crossed with surgical apparatus, its body studded with rusted needles and suppurating wounds that might have been mouths or reproductive organs or sensory structures, its presence radiating a warmth that felt nurturing despite the revulsion it inspired. It spoke to us, or we heard its voice, though nothing resembling speech organs were visible, promising healing and relief from pain and the cessation of suffering that all mortals craved, and several of my squad mates lowered their weapons before Hollis opened fire, and the thing screamed in what sounded like disappointment rather than pain. We killed it, or thought we did, reduced its physical form to ichor and scattered meat through sustained lasgun fire and a well-placed crack grenade. But by then the damage was done. The spores or psychic corruption or whatever vector Nurgle's servants used to spread their particular brand of love had already infected us, settling into our lungs and bloodstreams and neural tissue with the patience of something that understood mortality was illusion and corruption was simply transformation by another name. The fever came first for Trooper Kiney, the youngest in our squad, barely 18 standard and still carrying the idealism that boot camp hadn't managed to burn away, and he complained of heat spreading through his chest like warm honey, comfortable almost, easing the chronic cough he'd developed in the Hulk's toxic atmosphere. The squad Medicae examined him, found elevated temperature and some minor inflammation, but nothing that warranted serious concern. Prescribed rest and hydration and standard antipyretics, completely missing the signs because we'd all been trained to recognize Nurgle's plagues as rot and decay and pustulant horror, not this insidious warmth that promised comfort even as it reshaped us from within. Kine died 3 days later. Or what we initially thought was death, his fever spiking to lethal levels before his body simply stopped responding to stimuli, vital signs flatlining across every monitor, while his flesh remained warm and supple and disturbingly alive. The Medicae pronounced him dead, prepared to process his corpse according to regulation, but when they moved to transfer his body it sat up, and Kane looked at us with eyes that still held his awareness, though something else peered out from behind them, and he told us in a voice thick with fluid and joy that he felt wonderful, that the pain was gone, that we should stop fighting the gift that the grandfather offered, because acceptance would bring such relief from the suffering that defined existence in the Imperium's service. The Medicae shot him, point blank through the skull, and Kiney's body slumped back onto the examination slab, properly dead this time, or as properly dead as anything touched by Nurgle could be, and we all felt the fever bloom in our chests like flowers opening to diseased sunlight. Command quarantined us after that, confined the entire regiment to a sealed section of the ship, while tech priests and Medicae staff scrambled to determine if we were contaminated beyond salvation or if Imperial medical science could purge whatever corruption we'd contracted. They ran every test in their considerable arsenal, drew blood and tissue samples, monitored our vitals constantly, subjected us to prayer rituals and chemical treatments, and bombardment with radiation that should have killed us, but merely made us uncomfortable. And nothing worked because the fever wasn't infection in any conventional sense but transformation. Nurgle's love expressed through cellular modification and spiritual corruption that no amount of antibiotics or faith could reverse. The warmth spread through me day by day, starting in my chest and radiating outward through my limbs, settling into my joints and muscles with a comfort I'd never experienced in 15 years of military service, easing aches and pains I'd carried so long I'd forgotten they existed. And I started to understand why Kane had looked so peaceful even as the Medicae put a last round through his brain. My wound healed during quarantine, an old injury from a training accident that had left my left hand partially crippled, the fingers never quite regaining full mobility, despite the Medicae's efforts and the tech priest's suggestions about augmetic replacement. I woke one morning to find the scarred tissue gone, replaced with smooth skin that looked somehow too healthy, too perfect, like the hand of someone who'd never known manual labor or combat, and when I flexed my fingers they moved with fluid grace that exceeded even my pre-injury capability, bending in ways that seemed slightly wrong, achieving ranges of motion that human anatomy shouldn't permit. I reported this to the Medicae staff, showed them the transformation, and they documented it with expressions that cycled through horror and fascination and grim understanding, because they recognized what was happening even if I didn't yet. Understood that Nurgle's healing wasn't restoration of what had been but improvement, enhancement, the body remade according to principles that valued function over form and ignored entirely the barriers that separated living flesh from cancerous growth. The fever intensified after the hand healed, the warmth becoming almost unbearable, my body temperature climbing to levels that should have induced seizures and organ failure but instead produced a strange euphoria, a sense of well-being that grew stronger as my body weakened in conventional metrics, my skin developing a waxy sheen, and my breath acquiring a sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit. The Medicae increased their intervention attempts, subjecting me to increasingly aggressive treatments that ranged from chemical cocktails designed to purge demon taint to actual exorcism performed by a visiting ecclesiarchy priest who spent 3 hours chanting litanies over my bed, while I lay sweating and smiling despite myself because the warmth was so comforting, so much like being held, and the priest's words seemed to slide off me like water off oiled leather, unable to gain purchase in flesh that had accepted its transformation with open arms. My squad mates were going through similar changes, each one experiencing variations on the same theme of excessive healing, bodies repairing damage with enthusiastic disregard for proper human anatomy. Sergeant Hollis's combat scars accumulated across 20 years of service and worn with pride as marks of survival and competence began closing spontaneously. The tissue knitting together and then continuing to grow, excess flesh piling up in grotesque ridges that resembled keloid scarring but possessed disturbing regularity, patterns that might have been decorative if they weren't made of human skin. Corporal Ven's chronic back injury from a cargo loader accident resolved itself overnight. But his spine continued healing, the vertebrae fusing and multiplying, his torso elongating by centimeters each day until he stood nearly 2 meters tall and complained that his uniform no longer fit, his voice holding wonder rather than horror because the pain that had plagued him for years was finally, blessedly gone. Trooper Maris lost her teeth in the 3rd week, all of them falling out over the course of a single night, and when the Medicae examined her in the morning, they found new teeth already erupting through her gums, dozens of them in irregular rows, sharp and overlapping and utterly wrong for a human mouth but functional, allowing her to eat normally, though she complained that food tasted different now, sweeter and richer, and she found herself craving things that made the Medicae staff recoil in disgust when she described them. Private Jex's lungs healed from the atmospheric damage we'd all sustained in the Plague Hulk, the scarred tissue regenerating with such vigor that he developed extra alveoli, his breathing capacity increasing beyond normal human levels until he could hold his breath for 5 minutes straight, and his speech became unnaturally smooth and flowing, never requiring pause for respiration, his words running together in streams that made listening to him feel like drowning. The Medicae documented everything with clinical detachment that frayed increasingly as the weeks passed and our transformations accelerated, their reports to command growing more desperate in tone, though maintaining proper bureaucratic structure, because even when confronting Nurgle's corruption, the administratum's forms must be completed correctly. They tried separation, isolating us individually in sealed cells to prevent whatever contagion we carried from spreading through proximity. But the fever continued regardless, burning in us with its paradoxical warmth that brought comfort and mutation in equal measure. They tried starvation, theorizing that denying us nutrients would slow the transformations, but our bodies proved disturbingly efficient, extracting sustenance from sources the Medicae refused to identify in their reports, our flesh continuing to reshape itself even as we lost weight in conventional measurements. I started losing pieces during the isolation period, my body deciding that certain components were unnecessary and discarding them with casual efficiency that terrified me even as it brought relief. My appendix went first, painlessly expelled during what I initially thought was normal elimination, followed by my tonsils, which I simply coughed up one morning, intact and glistening on my cell floor, where they continued to pulse with residual life until a servitor collected them for medical analysis. The fever celebrated each loss with increased warmth, the heat in my chest intensifying until it felt like I was being embraced by some vast maternal presence that loved me with an intensity that normal human affection could never match, and I started to understand why the cultists we'd fought across my career looked so peaceful even as we put them down, why they sang hymns to the grandfather even as last fire reduced them to ash and memory. My hand continued evolving, the fingers elongating and developing additional joints, the skin thickening into something resembling bark or keratin, protective and tough and distinctly inhuman, and I discovered I could now bend my fingers entirely backward, could fold them into configurations that let me grip objects from multiple angles simultaneously, could perform tasks that had been impossible with standard human anatomy. The Medicae tested my grip strength and found it had tripled, tested my dexterity and found I could manipulate tools with precision that would have taken years of training to develop naturally, and they documented these enhancements with the same clinical horror they'd applied to the grotesque aspects of my transformation, because they understood that this was the real danger of Nurgle's healing, not that it destroyed, but that it improved. Not that it killed, but that it enhanced in ways that made the original form seem inadequate by comparison. The transformations became more elaborate as time passed, our bodies settling into new configurations that maintained functionality while violating every principle of human anatomy. My chest expanded to accommodate additional organs whose purpose I couldn't identify but whose presence felt necessary, the ribs spreading and multiplying to protect the growing mass of tissue within, my heart developing auxiliary chambers that improved circulation beyond baseline human capabilities, my lungs branching into configurations that let me process atmospheric toxins that would have killed me before the fever. I became more than I had been, enhanced and improved and utterly corrupted. And the horror was that I felt grateful that the warmth in my chest had spread through my entire being until gratitude was my default emotional state, appreciation for the grandfather's gifts, overwhelming every other response until even fear and disgust became flavors of joy. The Medicae stopped attempting treatment after the first month, their interventions having proven not just ineffective but counterproductive, each attempt to reverse our transformations somehow accelerating them, as if Nurgle's corruption fed on opposition and grew stronger through resistance. They maintained observation, documented our continued changes with meticulous detail that would be filed in archives somewhere and possibly studied by future generations trying to understand the ruinous powers' methodologies, but they no longer tried to heal us because we were already healed, overhealed, excessively and grotesquely healed beyond anything mortal flesh was meant to endure. Command debated our fates through Vox channels we weren't supposed to be able to access but which my transformed hearing let me perceive with perfect clarity, the officers and commissariat representatives and inquisitorial observers discussing whether to execute us immediately or study us further or attempt to weaponize our conditions for deployment against other chaos forces. Sergeant Hollis hanged himself during the second month, or tried to, fashioning a noose from his bedding and suspending himself from the cell's light fixture, with what must have been considerable effort given his enlarged frame, and we found him the next morning, still hanging there, neck stretched and discolored, but breathing normally, his transformed body refusing to die from what should have been fatal strangulation. The Medicae cut him down and he laughed, a wet gurgling sound that might have been caused by his deformed throat or might have been genuine amusement, explaining that he'd simply wanted to test whether we could still die by conventional means, whether there was any escape from what we'd become besides whatever the Inquisition had planned for us, and the answer was no. We couldn't die, or couldn't die easily, our bodies too resilient and too enthusiastically alive to cease functioning from mere physical trauma. The fever reached its peak during the 3rd month, the warmth in my chest becoming almost unbearable in its intensity, like I'd swallowed a small sun that radiated comfort and corruption in equal measure, and I experienced a moment of absolute clarity when I understood that I was no longer human in any meaningful sense, that Nurgle's healing had transformed me into something new, something that used Marcus Valen's body and memories as foundation for construction of a being that exceeded human limitations while abandoning human identity. This clarity should have brought despair, but instead brought peace, acceptance of what I'd become and relief that the struggle was over, that I no longer needed to resist or maintain the fiction of unchanged humanity, that I could simply be what the grandfather had made me, a vessel for his love expressed through cellular transformation and spiritual corruption that violated every principle of imperial doctrine while fulfilling every promise of relief from suffering that our propaganda claimed the emperor provided but never actually delivered. My voice changed somewhere in the 4th month, the fever having reshaped my vocal cords and throat structure into something that produced sounds no human throat should generate, harmonics and overtones that made listening to me speak feel like being touched, like my words had physical presence and emotional weight that normal speech couldn't carry. The Medicae documented this with particular interest, noting that my transformed voice seemed to affect listeners' emotional states, inducing calm and contentment in those who heard me speak for extended periods, and they theorized that I was unconsciously projecting some aspect of Nurgle's corruption through sonic channels, spreading the fever through auditory contact, though their tests never conclusively proved this hypothesis. The quarantine section became a garden of sorts as our transformations reached what might have been their final stages, each of us cultivating growths and developing mutations that beautified us in Nurgle's aesthetic, even as they horrified anyone viewing us through conventional human standards of form and function. Corporal Ven's elongated spine sprouted protrusions that resembled flowers or fungi, delicate structures that released spores when he moved, filling his cell with clouds of particulate matter that the Medicae refused to analyze after the first researcher developed symptomatic fever within hours of exposure. Trooper Maris's excess teeth pushed through her cheeks and forehead, creating patterns that might have been decorative in some alien culture, her face becoming more skull-like as bone structure asserted dominance over soft tissue. And she told me through the cell walls that she could taste colors now, that the world had become so much richer since the transformation. Private Jex's respiratory enhancement continued until breathing became his primary activity, his chest expanding and contracting in rhythms that seemed synchronized with something beyond his control, and he claimed he could feel the breath of every living thing in the quarantine section, could sense their life force through some new sensory organ that had developed in his transformed lungs, could track their emotional states through variations in their breathing patterns. The Medicae installed monitoring equipment to study this claim and found that Jex's breathing did indeed synchronize with nearby life signs, his inhalations and exhalations matching the respiratory rates of people several cells distant, suggesting some form of psychic or bioreactive connection that shouldn't have been possible for someone with no documented psyker abilities. My own transformation settled into what felt like stable configuration sometime during the 5th month, my body having achieved a form that satisfied whatever criteria Nurgle's corruption used to determine completion. I stood nearly 2 meters tall now, my frame having expanded to accommodate the additional organs and enhanced musculature that the fever had grown within me, my skin thick and waxy with a greenish undertone that suggested chlorophyll or some other photosynthetic compound, though I still required normal food for sustenance. My hand, the one that had healed first and triggered everything else, had become my most elaborate feature, the fingers now resembling branching coral or perhaps nervous tissue externalized, capable of gripping and manipulating objects with precision that exceeded any human hand, while looking utterly alien, utterly wrong to anyone observing it through conventional aesthetic standards. But I felt good. That was the horror and the truth of Nurgle's healing. I felt better than I'd ever felt in my life, the chronic pain and accumulated damage from 15 years of military service completely gone, my body functioning with efficiency and power I'd never experienced even in my youth, my mind clear and focused despite the obvious corruption of my flesh. The warmth remained in my chest, eternal and comforting. A constant reminder of the grandfather's love and my transformation from broken soldier into something improved, enhanced, perfected according to principles that the Imperium would call daemonic, but which felt more authentic and honest than any imperial doctrine I'd been taught. The Inquisition arrived during the 6th month. A representative from the Ordo Malleus, accompanied by a retinue of stormtroopers and what might have been a sanctioned psyker whose face was hidden behind Baroque masking and whose presence made my transformed nervous system ache in ways that weren't quite pain. They examined us through observation ports and scanning equipment, documenting our conditions with the same clinical detachment the Medicae had displayed, but with additional layers of analysis that suggested they were searching for specific information rather than simply cataloging mutations. The Inquisitor, a woman whose augmetic eye glowed with cold blue light and whose voice carried authority that even our transformed states couldn't entirely dismiss, explained through the Vox system that we represented valuable data about Nurgle's corruption methodologies, that our excessive healing had progressed further than any documented cases in the Ordo's archives, that we would be transferred to research facility for further study and possible weaponization if our conditions could be reversed or controlled. This was lie, of course. Transparent even to my transformed consciousness, which could read the Inquisitor's emotional state through her breathing patterns and voice modulations, thanks to whatever psychic sensitivity the fever had developed in me. She intended to execute us, would probably burn us to ash to ensure complete eradication of whatever corruption we carried, but wanted us compliant for transport rather than resistant, wanted to move us to facility where our deaths could be conducted properly with appropriate ritual and documentation. I considered warning my squad mates but realized they already knew that their transformations had granted them similar perceptive abilities, that we all understood we were dead regardless of what happened next, that the only variable was whether we went peacefully or fighting. Sergeant Hollis chose fighting, or his transformed body chose it, the fever having progressed in him further than the rest of us, his mutations having reached some critical threshold where human consciousness lost dominance and Nurgle's nature asserted control. He attacked the stormtroopers when they entered to begin transfer procedures, his enlarged frame moving with speed that shouldn't have been possible given his bulk, his hands now more claws than human appendages tearing through their armor with ease that shocked even the Inquisitor. They put him down with concentrated hellgun fire, reducing him to charred meat and shattered bone. But even dying, he laughed, that wet gurgling sound I'd heard when he'd survived his hanging attempt, and his corpse continued to twitch and grow for several minutes after his heart stopped beating, new tissue attempting to regenerate from the damage faster than the flames could consume it. The Inquisitor decided on immediate execution after that, abandoning the fiction of research and transfer, ordering the stormtroopers to purge us cell by cell with flame and high-intensity las fire, to reduce us to ash that would be collected and possibly studied, but more likely simply disposed of, according to standard protocols for Nurgle-tainted materials. I watched through my cell's observation port as they worked systematically through the quarantine section, heard my transformed squad mates screaming or laughing or singing hymns to the grandfather as fire consumed them, and I waited my turn with the same calm acceptance that had characterized my entire transformation, the fever's warmth insulating me from fear or regret or any emotion except gratitude that I'd experienced this, that I'd been chosen for the grandfather's love, even if that love was ending now in flames and purification. But something went wrong during Corporal Ven's execution, his spore-producing growths releasing massive clouds of particulate matter as the flames touched them, the spores igniting and creating secondary explosions that breached the quarantine section's containment, and suddenly the Inquisitor and her retinue were exposed to the same corruption that had transformed us, the fever spreading through them with enthusiastic speed as if it had been waiting for fresh victims, and I heard screaming from the observation deck that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the horrified realization that they were about to experience what they'd planned to destroy. The stormtroopers turned their weapons on each other, some trying to mercy kill their comrades before transformation could take hold, others simply collapsing as the fever bloomed in their chests with the same comforting warmth I'd felt months ago, and the Inquisitor was shouting orders that nobody followed because fear and corruption had broken the chain of command that held her authority together. I emerged from my cell during the chaos, the locking mechanisms having failed when containment breached, and walked through corridors filled with smoke and spores, and the writhing bodies of stormtroopers experiencing accelerated transformation, their augmetic enhancements attempting to purge the corruption even as their organic components embraced it, creating hybrid forms that were somehow more grotesque than pure mutation. The Inquisitor stood in the center of the observation deck, her augmetic eye flickering erratically as biomechanical interface tried to process sensory input from a body that was no longer following human biological principles, and she looked at me with expression that cycled through rage and fear and dawning comprehension, understanding finally what I'd experienced, what excessive healing actually meant when administered by power that loved too much and healed too thoroughly. I left them there, walked through the breached containment and into the ship's main corridors where alarm klaxons were already sounding and crew members were sealing bulkheads and preparing for full quarantine protocols, but the spores were already spreading, carried through the ventilation systems, and by personnel who'd been exposed and didn't yet realize they were infected, the fever beginning its work in hundreds of bodies simultaneously. I made my way to the escape pods, not from any plan, but simply because movement felt appropriate, because my transformed body wanted to continue existing, and escape pods offered that possibility, and I encountered no resistance because anyone who saw me either fled in horror or attacked ineffectively with sidearms that my enhanced physiology largely ignored. The lass burns healing almost instantly, and the physical trauma insufficient to stop flesh that refused to acknowledge conventional limitations. I jettisoned in Pod 17, felt the violent acceleration as magnetic catapults launched me away from the ship, watched through the small viewport as the vessel attempted to contain what had been unleashed but failed, the infection spreading too quickly and too thoroughly, the entire crew experiencing variations of the transformation my squad had undergone, the ship itself becoming plague vessel, though nobody had intentionally created it, Nurgle's love simply too enthusiastic and too persistent to contain through standard Imperial quarantine procedures. The last thing I saw before the pod's viewport sealed was the ship's reactor going critical, someone having triggered self-destruct rather than let the infection spread further, the vessel detonating in a flash of light that would have been beautiful if I'd still been capable of aesthetic judgment, unclouded by the fever's influence. The pod drifted for what might have been days or weeks, my enhanced biology keeping me alive without food or water through mechanisms I didn't understand and didn't particularly care to analyze, the fever sustaining me through pure metabolic efficiency that bypassed normal nutritional requirements. I experienced the journey as single continuous moment, time losing coherence when your body no longer follows circadian rhythms and your consciousness exists in state of permanent warmth-induced contentment, and when the pod finally crashed on some agri-world whose name I never learned, I emerged into humid air and fertile soil and environment that my transformed senses perceived as paradise, every scent and texture and sound registering as pleasure, because the fever had reshaped my entire perceptual framework around comfort and growth, and the endless cycle of decay as renewal that defined Nurgle's domain. I walk among the agri-world's population now, spreading the fever through contact and proximity and simple presence, the excessive healing offered freely to anyone who'll accept it, and most do eventually because pain is universal and relief is precious, and the grandfather's love is patient and thorough and inexorable. The Imperium will eventually notice this world's corruption, will probably sterilize it from orbit rather than risk ground engagement against full-scale Nurgle infestation, will reduce our garden to lifeless ash, and think they've won because ash doesn't spread infection, doesn't carry spores, doesn't whisper promises of healing to soldiers with chronic injuries and workers with aching backs and children with congenital conditions that Imperial medicine can't or won't address. But the spores will survive somehow, or the idea will survive, or something will carry forward because Nurgle's love is persistent and excessive and ultimately unstoppable, healing too much and improving too thoroughly and transforming what should die into what cannot die. spreading relief and horror in equal measure until the entire galaxy is garden of delightful corruption, where pain is memory and suffering is choice and healing is eternal, whether you want it or not. The fever continues, warm and comforting in my chest, and I am grateful. I am transformed. I am healed. And the grandfather loves me too much to ever let me go.